limited these sciences, dealing only with questions that were relevant to them. Success, however, naturally led theorists in other fields to copy details of their methods in the hope of getting the same results. Their imitations produced a special kind of fairy tale whose scientific language and detail seemed to supply the magic that was needed to subvert traditional views on ordinary life. Thus, once it was declared that the brain was just a computer made of meat and houses were only machines for living in, everything began to look different. The imaginative effect of all this has not, I think, yet been sufficiently noticed. Because symbols were not distinguished from literal truth here, a general impression has got abroad that literal truth is the only form of truth, that symbols are some kind of optional extra, and that literal truth is only found in the physical sciences. As I remark later on in this audiobook, the trouble with Enlightenment myths when they get out of hand is that they tend to exalt the form over the substance of what is being said, the method over the aim of an activity, and precision of detail over completeness of cover. The machine imagery that is used in these last two cases is a graphic example of this. It arose from the 17th century fascination with clockwork, and it has continued to figure in all kinds of areas of our thought as a kind of will-o'-the-wisp, an imagined ideal example of methodical thinking, a model of scholarly method by contrast to mere subjective impressions. Newton's representation of the universe as a vast clock was an early case of this. That image appealed so powerfully to all sorts of thinkers that they often hoped to produce equal neatness in their own awkward provinces by imitating its simplicity. Thus, Hume justified his reliance on utility as a universal explanation for the wild varieties of human motives by remarking that Newton's chief rule in philosophizing was always to use a single force to account for many different effects. It wasn't, yet this kind of impression remained widespread. The ambition to be the Newton of psychology by simplifying everything seized many thinkers and carried with it an increasing load of mechanistic imagery, analogies with literal machines which were used to explain more and more aspects of human life. Of course, the defects of this approach have long been noticed. John Stuart Mill protested against it in the third chapter of On Liberty. Supposing it were possible to get houses built, corn grown, battles fought, causes tried, and even churches erected and prayers said by machinery, by automatons in human form, it would be a considerable loss to exchange for these automatons even the men and women who at present inhabit the more civilized parts of the world. Human nature is not a machine to be built after a model and set to do exactly the work prescribed for it, but a tree which requires to grow and develop itself on all sides, according to the tendency of the inward forces which make it a living thing. As he said, machines are not really very like people. Analogies between them need to be treated with great caution. And this sort of complaint had not been confined to the humanities. At the other extreme of the scientific hierarchy, physics no longer views matter as operating in the least like clockwork. The solid, impenetrable particles that Newton took to be its foundation are long gone, taking with them the Newtonian idea that all motion resulted from their bouncing off one another. Matter, whatever it may be, is no longer mechanistic. This means that the whole idea of materialism really needs to be rethought, and today's physics is far too complicated to supply a good basis for myth building. Apart, however, from the still vigorous physical imagery of mechanism, today's favored myths center rather on biology and work largely by exploiting the idea of evolution as a way of celebrating competition. Thus, talk of rival investments, grudgers and suckers, war games, selfish genes, and so forth is obviously essentially mythical. We know that the strange supernatural beings who seem to figure in these stories are not supposed to be real. This is a way of talking about natural tendencies and forces.